Well, good afternoon. I realize this is the tough time of the day, unless you all just got a nap like I did, and then you'll probably want to take another one anyways. The afternoon session is the toughest. Got all that food going. I'm sure everyone is just being very good and staying right on your diet and stuff like that. You're not supposed to do that while you're on a cruise anyways, but I have a feeling most of you heard the comments that I made on this text about 2 weeks ago, so I'm going to actually go through this a little bit more quickly, but it is important just to remind us of its presence and its importance in apologetics. I really think it's one of the most forgotten texts in reminding us of the fact that from God's perspective, there is a way that he has chosen to use to draw his people into himself, and it's not the way the world would expect. I suppose this would actually have more relevance to a large portion of Christian academia than it does anything else. There is, unfortunately, a desire on the part of many people to be accepted by the world, to be seen as colleagues, as a part of the group, even by those in the world. The problem is that there is a fundamental contrast between those who bow the knee to the Lordship of Christ and those who do not. And when it comes to how we even practice our academics, again, it is a radical thing to claim that God has entered into his own creation, and that is considered foolishness to the world. Here is the text that says that. I will be brief. I want to go through it, but I want to make some application. The word of the cross, that term cross, extremely strong word, very, very reprehensible to a large portion of people in the ancient world. To die by crucifixion was considered a dirty, despicable death. And there were some people in the ancient world who wouldn't even use the verbal form of this word because it was off color. It was that bad. But the word or the message of the cross, and then you have two groups, is indeed to the perishing ones foolishness. But to the being saved ones, us, it is the power of God. So it's one message. The message is not changed. The content of the message is identical. And it is the nature of those who hear it that determines how they will interpret what that message is. And so to the perishing ones, it's foolishness. They cannot see how this story has any relevance to them whatsoever. They cannot see how this could be something that God would do. I mean, just start putting all the excuses that man has used over the ages into the list, and to those who are perishing, foolishness. But to those who are being saved, us, power of God. One message seen in two completely different ways, and it depends upon the spiritual status of the individual as to how it's to be interpreted. There's nothing about neutrality here. There's no room for neutrality. There is a theology that underlies this, and if you reject that theology, that's going to be made explicit here in a few moments, you'll never be on the same page as the Apostle Paul in regards to the nature of the cross, the nature of the message of the cross, the nature of those who are perishing, the nature of those who are being saved, nothing. You'll always have to be out of step. Then he gives some texts. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise ones, and the understanding of the understanding ones I will set aside. And then he asks, where is the Saphos, the wise one? That would be the philosopher as well. Where is the grammatus, the scribe, the learned one? Where is the disputer or the debater of this age, that is, of this world, the one that disputes based upon the concepts and the thinking of this particular age? And then, honestly, here's one of the questions you have to ask anyone who would engage our culture and our world. Has not God made foolish? Now, we say made foolish because we don't have a verb to foolish someone. but Greek does. Has not God foolished the Sophion to Kosmu, the wisdom of this world? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of this world? Now, you can tell, sort of just by the way we say it, what the expected answer is, but Greek will tell you what the expected answer is. When you use uk, you're expecting a positive, and me, you're expecting a negative. So yes, God has made foolish the wisdom of this world. So what does that mean? Do we really believe that? When I see Christians constantly seeking to utilize the wisdom of the world for the furtherance of the gospel, I really wonder, do you just not believe what Paul says here? When I see people trying to remove the offensiveness of the gospel to the unregenerate man, I'm just like, have you caught this part? Because Paul knew his audience. He knew exactly. For since in the wisdom of God, the world, through its wisdom, did not come to know God. So God set it up this way. This wasn't just, oh, well, Adam fell, didn't see that coming. Okay, what am I going to do now? This whole idea of the gospel being plan B and all the rest of that stuff, and there are various theological systems that have come up with that idea. No, it's the wisdom of God, that the world by its wisdom does not come to know God. The whole idea of climbing the mountain and finding the wise person at the top and the guru tells you what to do, no. God says that's never been my plan. Instead, God was well pleased. God was well pleased. What's well pleasing to God, unfortunately, doesn't figure in a lot of theological systems in our day. God was well pleased through the moria, the foolishness of the kerygma, the kerygmetos, the message that is preached to save the ones believing. So the kerygma, which is the message of the cross, this is another way of just using the same, referring to the same thing, will always be considered foolishness by the world. There is nothing in the text that indicates, well, actually, someday it's going to get better, and someday the world will say, oh yeah, that's just brilliant. That's a brilliant idea. That's a brilliant concept. That is, as far as we can tell from Scripture, what the Apostle Paul himself had experienced in his encounters with the wise men of the world. That God has chosen to save certain people, not based upon their exercising of wisdom, but based upon the preaching of the message. He knew his audience, he knew what they wanted. For indeed, the Jews are seeking signs. They want to see the miraculous. Read the Gospels, what sign do you show? What sign is the same term is used. The Jews seek for signs, ask for signs, and the Greeks, they are seeking zeteo sophia, wisdom. The Greeks want philosophy. They want wisdom. But we, so it is meant as a contrast, but we proclaim Christ having been crucified. We know what they want. Here's what we give them. We do not give them what they want. It's not signs, and it's not from their perspective wisdom. But we proclaim a crucified Messiah. And he knows, to the Jews, indeed, scandalon. Scandalon. It's a scandal. It's a stumbling stone. The idea of the Messiah being crucified? No, that's not what we expect. No, the Messiah is supposed to lead Israel to rulership over all the nations, and everyone's going to flow into Mount Zion and worship God, and that's not, it has to be right now. That's what our traditions have said. We preach Christ crucified. The Jews, indeed, a scandalon. To the Gentiles, and there's a textual variant there, some of them say to the Greeks, again, morion, foolishness. But to those, tois kletois, to the called. To those who are called. Now, what you do with that, it seems very clear to me. If you're going to be honest with the Apostle Paul, you read the Golden Chain of Redemption, Romans chapter 8, you have those who are called, Those who are called are justified, those who are justified are glorified. This is a specific group, and unless you're a universalist and believe everyone's going to be saved someday, there is no way to see the specificity that is a part of the biblical message. But notice, to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God, and the wisdom of God. So what did we see earlier? We saw perishing, foolishness. Being saved, power of God. Well, why would anybody be being saved? Because they're called. Because they're God's chosen ones. And to the elect, Jews and Gentiles, Christ, the power of God, and the wisdom of God. Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, the weakness of God is stronger than men. He reminds the Corinthians, look to your own calling, brethren. Not many of you are saphoi, kata sarka. Not many of you are wise according to the flesh. Not many are dunatoi, have much power in this world. Not many of you, check that word out, eugeneis, from which we get eugenics. Well-born. So rich, powerful, upper class type situation. He says, look at your own church. Look at your own congregation. Who is God calling? And see, from the world's perspective, and I've seen this, unfortunately, many times in the apologetic realm, there is an embarrassment. Well, look at all the Nobel Prize winners that say there's no need for a creator. Paul knew that a long time ago. It's right here in our text. And if it's just a guide for us, then maybe that's not enough. But if it really is God-breathed, then maybe we should have been listening to this and recognizing this all along. And maybe we wouldn't have had some of the scandals of the rise of the Roman Church and all the wisdom and power. And if you've ever been to the Vatican and looked at all the marble and gold and everything else, maybe if we had just listened to this and kept believing this. But it's right there. But according to the text, God has chosen, not man, ta mora tu kosmu, the foolish things of the world, that he might shame tus safus, the wise. And the weak things of the world God has chosen. He might shame the things that are strong. And the agene, the not well-born, not the prettiest people, not the smartest people, the agene of the world, and the things that are not God has chosen, the things that are not, nor might shame the things that are. Why say all this? What's he introducing? In order that no flesh may boast before God. Because you see, if it is a matter of intellectual attainment and following after in-depth theological proofs, then you would have reason to boast before God over against others. In eternity, you could stand there and say, well, I'm, God's lucky to have me. Those folks down there and in the fire just didn't have the intellectual furniture that I've got, and so I'm sure the Lord's very happy to have my presence for all of eternity. No. As it says in verse 30, ex autou, by him, by his doing, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God and righteousness and sanctification and redemption, in order that just as has been written, let he who boasts boast in the Lord. The whole point of the centrality of the gospel and the means that God has chosen to do it is to absolutely strip from mankind any ground of boasting whatsoever. To recognize it's all of grace or not of grace at all. Now, if you have a gospel that is not all of grace, this isn't going to make any sense. And you're not going to be able to consistently follow after this in your apologetics either. And that's what we see so often happening in the world. I have a clip here. You can tell how I was expecting to get to things. What I'm going to do, I'm going to have to do time-wise, is I'm going to have to summarize for you one side, then I'll play for you briefly the other. Normally I take a little bit more time, but we only have a certain amount of time together. For years, I have summarized, I started teaching apologetics initially on the graduate level at Golden Gate Baptist Theological Seminary up in, used to be located in Mill Valley, California. Beautiful, beautiful place up there, just across the Golden Gate Bridge. And the first year I was asked to do that, sometime late 90s, as I recall. May have been early 2000s. It all merges together after a while. I was listening to a debate between William Lane Craig and Frank Zindler that had been recorded at Willow Creek Church. So, well attended, shall we say. Very, very well attended. And as I listened to Dr. Craig's very polished, well-practiced, very philosophically oriented opening statement, I could not help but think of another debate that took place in 1985 between an atheist by the name of Dr. Bonson Stein and a Christian by the name of Dr. Greg Bonson. Now, how many of you in this room have heard the classic Bonson Stein debate? Okay, about 40%. Certainly one of the first introductions I had to the divide that exists fundamentally in apologetic methodology, and that is between what is classically known as presuppositionalism, what is being called by some of its modern practitioners, such as Dr. Oliphant, as covenantal apologetics, and what is generally called either classical apologetics, Aquinas' apologetics, evidentialist apologetics, whatever it might be. Now, interestingly enough, I'm going to have to ask Mike to restrain Ryan in the other room if he happens to be. Is Ryan out there? Ryan's out there? Okay, someone, Josh, if he tries to bull rush me, you can take him? Okay, you're going to have to hold on to Ryan back there? Okay. Because
he's watching
when it comes to
he's watching you.
When it comes to apologetic methodology, yeah, you trying to call somebody right now? Yeah.
RC on speaker.
Yeah, I got RC on speaker. Yeah. When it comes to apologetic methodology, I'll never forget, what year was it that Ligonier was in Scottsdale? So you remember years much better than I do.
09?
Yeah, it was actually 2000 and no, it was 2009. That was
2009.
May of 2009.
May of 2009. Okay. How many of you have heard the Bonson-Sproul debate? 1, 2. Ryan, how about you?
No.
No? Oh, then you may not bull rush me. That's good. Okay, that's all right. All right. Sometime in, I don't remember what the date was. I think it was sometime early 90s at some point, because Dr. Bonson died in 1995. In fact, fascinatingly, Gordon Stein and Greg Bonson died within 6 months of each other, 10 years after the debate took place. Very, very odd. Somewhere in that time period, a debate was held between R.C. Sproul and Greg Bonson, because Dr. Sproul practices what we call classical apologetics.
No, I have read that.
I'm sorry?
I have read that, yes.
You've what?
I have read that.
Yes, okay. And I would highly recommend it to folks so you can hear both sides. In fact, for years when I taught apologetics at Golden Gate, I actually assigned the Sproul, Gershner, Lindsley book, Defending Classical Apologetics, even from a Reformed perspective, so people could hear both sides. But obviously, from my perspective, my argument is going to be that covenantal apologetics, presuppositional apologetics, is simply forced upon us by our Reformed faith, by consistent application of the Reformed faith and understanding of the nature of man as an active rebel against God. And generally, those that oppose it are extremely impressed by one individual, and that's Thomas Aquinas. And Aquinas was a brilliant, brilliant mind. There's no question about that. But Aquinas, when it comes to the issue of man, was a Roman Catholic. Now, I don't even know if you can use that term properly at that point, because when people ask me, when did Rome start? Historical things like that absolutely defy simplistic answers. Can you find all the way back in a Leo in the 5th century pretensions to the papacy? Yes, but do you have the full-blown doctrine of the papacy that you have in Roman Catholicism with a Leo? No, you don't. What about the gospel? What about the sacraments? Well, unfortunately, they all developed over time at different rates, and at any one point in time, you have different streams coming together to form something. When someone says, well, look, give me a date, give me, you're going to argue, when did Rome start as Roman Catholicism? I'd say the Fourth Lateran Council. And that's the beginning of the 13th century. So it's pretty contemporaneous with Aquinas, same general time period. The point is that when it comes to the nature of man and man's reason, Aquinas is not thoroughly biblical. And while he may have been brilliant, and while I fully recognize that from a Christian worldview, the theistic proofs that he presents, such as the cosmological argument, is valid in a theistic world. You have to have that foundation first. It's not gonna work if you don't have a theistic worldview, a Christian theistic worldview, to ground it in. And so back to the story I was telling you, having wandered all the way around the world at that point. I was listening to Dr. Craig debating Frank Zindler. And I think this is almost a direct quote from his opening statement. Almost a direct quote. The preponderance of the evidence points to the greater probability of the existence of a God. I want you to hear that. The preponderance of the evidence points to the greater probability of the existence of a God. Now, if you are familiar with the theistic proofs, when I talk about the cosmological argument, the argument from first cause, even the next to impossible to actually understand, and you can sort of work through it if you try really, really hard and you take 3 Advil and you won't remember it about 3 hours later, ontological argument for the existence of God, where you have to turn off all musical distractions and concentrate really, really hard and have other people help you, and then you've got it. And the problem is you won't have it tomorrow. Once you sleep, it's gone. That kind of argumentation where there's all sorts of categories you have to explain and things like that to come up with the ontological argument for the existence of God. Well, the problem with those as demonstrations of the existence of God is that they assume certain things that they sometimes aren't overly honest in assuming. And again, they are directed to individuals who, according to Scripture, are suppressing the truth. So they could be true in and of themselves, but what is that going to accomplish in dealing with an individual who already knows God exists? They are meant to try to prove to someone that God exists. But we've already seen in Romans chapter 1, they're already suppressing that knowledge. And so you can see there's a completely different approach as to what you're trying to do. One person is trying to give further information in the hopes that this person will accept the truthfulness of these arguments. But if you see that the person's already holding down the truth and putting a lot of effort into it, why are you going to put anything else under his hands? What you need to do is come along and start prying up his fingers. So that what's already there, he can't hold it down anymore. So there's a completely different process involved. And so, but if you think about those arguments, what do they prove? What does the argument from first cause prove? The existence of a nebulous, unknown God, whatever that is. And you might be able to throw some arguments in to make it sound like, well, it's got to be a personal
intelligent, communicative. You know, you might want to throw a few things in. Anyone remember Christopher Hitchens? You know, there's a guy, I was scheduled to debate him. We were 6 weeks out from our debate when he got the diagnosis of cancer. And we never had the opportunity of debating as a result. Obviously, you know, he passed away. Brilliant guy. And I remember listening to his debates. He debated Dr. Turek and other people. And I remember, and I've played years ago on the program, where he's arguing with evidentialist apologists, and even he, as an atheist, will come back and say, well, wait a minute, you're leaping from what you think you've proved the existence of a deity of some type all the way to the Christian God. You don't realize there's a huge leap there? You don't realize that there's a bunch of steps in there that you haven't even attempted? You know, okay, let's say a God exists. Why does he have to be the North Korean dictator God of Christianity? Is how Christopher Hitchens would put it. And the problem was he was exactly right. He had caught the people that he was debating fudging, thinking that, well, if God exists, then it must be my God. Well, there's one little problem with that. There's something, again, radically different about the Christian proclamation of who God is. He's triune. He's actually entered into his own creation. That's radical. That's wild. That's crazy. And so when I hear someone saying, well, the greater probability, the preponderance of the evidence points to the greater probability of the existence of a God, that ain't enough. When I was in seminary first time in Fuller, well, thankfully it was in Extension. It wasn't at the main campus. I took a class on apologetics, and I was already involved with apologetics, and so I was really excited about this. And the first few weeks, I couldn't figure this guy out. I'm like, what is he talking about? And he had us reading stuff by Francis Schaeffer and Blaise Pascal and all this stuff, and I'm going, what is, why isn't he giving us theistic proofs and stuff? Because I hadn't been exposed to any of the stuff I'm telling you about. And then one day in class, he was talking about theistic proofs, and he said something that just blew me away. He said, Aquinas proved the wrong God. Aquinas proved the wrong God. And I'm going. And what he pointed out was the true and living God cannot be reasoned backwards to from the limited creation he's made. He's so much bigger than that. He's so much bigger than that. He's not just a first cause. The triune God is glorifying himself in this entire drama of creation and redemption, the incarnation, all the rest of this stuff. You don't get that by going backwards from the fallen to the unfallen. And by then I had been reading through Pascal's Pensées. If you got some extra time or something like that, incredible stuff, especially when you read some of the background of the Jansenists and things like that. Really interesting. And of course Schaeffer's stuff, and that eventually led me to Van Til, and the world was ruined after that. So, but it truly made me think. I didn't realize you could prove the wrong God, but there is something absolutely unique about the Christian God over against the deities of men. And so the contrast then is found in listening to Greg Bonson's opening statement in his debate with Gordon Stein. The two men that they were debating were almost identical. Frank Zindler and Gordon Stein, just fundamentalist style, naturalistic, materialistic atheists. When I say fundamentalists, I mean just your standard American atheist type argumentation, nothing overly advanced at all. And so in his opening statement, in essence, after Bonson talks about how it's quite obvious that we don't know all things in the same way. You don't learn about love the same way that you learn about chemistry. And in fact, some of us never learn about chemistry, no matter how hard we try. And think that those that can learn chemistry might be a little bit on the odd side. Anyway, he pointed out that there's different ways of knowing and different means of coming to know things, and he used the crackers in the pantry fallacy, where he said there are obviously many questions about the universe that you do not answer in the same way as saying, are there some crackers in the pantry? Where you just walk over, open the door, and see if there are any crackers in the pantry. You can't answer questions of meaning in the same way as you answer the crackers in the, he called it the crackers in the pantry fallacy. And the reason he had to do this is he had listened enough to Gordon Stein to know that basically Stein said all questions, including the questions of God's existence, are answered in the same way. It's all done by science. Well, no, it's not. That doesn't make any sense. We all see it. But when it came to his offering of his proof was this: without the Christian God, you cannot explain anything else. You cannot explain why we're here this evening. You cannot explain why we think the way we're thinking. You cannot explain the laws of logic. You can't explain why the universe exists the way it does without the Christian God. And he specifically made the statement in his opening statement, I am not defending the existence of a God. A general theistic assertion of the existence of a God is irrational and indefensible. And he's exactly right. He's exactly right. This least common denominator, let's get it nice and small and teeny tiny, just this vague God type thing, doesn't work. It's irrational. You're not able to answer the meaningful questions when you have a deity who is unknown and has not revealed himself. And once you get around to the, well, yes, he exists, and he's revealed himself, and then you jump into what he's revealed about himself, all of a sudden the inconsistencies of your entire methodology come flowing out. And so I present these two as a huge contrast between the two methods of apologetics, and that those methods of apologetics simply come to us from the fact of the theology that underlies them. The theology that underlies them. Now, I did track down, I played this last week on the Dividing Lines, so some of you have already heard this, but there was a really fun exchange between Bonson and Stein. It is such a shame that it was not recorded in high quality. And you can tell it has been filtered and refiltered and filtered again and filtered until it's almost impossible to filter it anymore to try to clean it up. It was 1985 after all. I think in 1985 we were reproducing audio tapes on what was called a ghetto blaster, where you put one tape on one side, one tape on the other side, copy. And I think it might have even had a high speed, like maybe...
Two.
Yeah, ooh, it was great.
Double speed.
That was our level of, in 1985, that's what we were doing. So, what? Yes, I'm going to play something. Why?
Yeah, good.
I'm going to hold this over the microphones, over the speakers, so that...
Thank you.
You actually have a plug in there.
Oh!
We can do it much more.
Oh my, look at that.
Great, I just shared my backend.
Yeah, that's the entire world.
Hi, Facebook. Hope the sound is good.
Well, that will go over the top. All right. Here's the exchange between Bonson and Stein. Or I thought there was going to be an exchange between Bonson and Stein.
Oh. I see it playing.
Yeah.
It's scrolling. You might want to take a look at your properties.
Yeah.
There you go.
Oh, here, there we go. Headphone. All right. Go back. Let's try it again.
Huh.
Yeah, technology normally works quite well for us.
It's the MacBook, isn't it?
Ew.
I didn't say nothing.
I played it this morning just fine, so. See?
Okay.
I heard you mention logical binds and logical self-contradictions in your speech. You did say that? I used that phrase, yes. Do you believe there are laws of logic then?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Are they universal? They're agreed upon by human beings. They aren't laws that exist out in nature. Are they simply conventions then? They're conventions, but they're conventions that are self-verifying. Are they sociological laws or laws of thought? They are laws of thought which are interpreted by men and promulgated by men. Are they material in nature? How can a law be material? That's the question I'm going to ask you. I would say no. Dr. Bonson, would you call God material or immaterial? Immaterial. What is something that's immaterial? Something not extended in space. You can give an example of anything other than God that's immaterial. Lost logic.
That's called walking into a wall. Can you give us any laws? That was one of the. I've only had a few of those in my debates. One of them was a debate with Jerry Matitix on Long Island, but that's one of the classic examples of where someone had studied the other person's position very thoroughly, and then the other one had not returned that favor. And those debates do tend to create a number of interesting situations like that. But obviously, the origination of the laws of logic was a real problem for Stein, and he struggled the whole evening to fit into his worldview the regularity of the laws of logic, the laws of the natural universe, etc., etc. He could not account for the regularity of these things and for the centrality of these things in his own thinking in that particular debate. But the point was that the fundamental theistic proof that was offered by Dr. Bonson was right there, that apart from the Christian God, not just any old God, but the Christian God, you cannot make sense of what we're doing here this evening. And what he did the rest of the evening was keep demonstrating where Stein was borrowing from a theistic worldview to hold up his atheistic worldview. Now, I believe that's consistent. If you would like to read more about that, as I mentioned, Dr. Oliphant put a book out a couple years ago called Covenantal Apologetics. There's been different practitioners of that methodology from Francis Schaeffer onward. Van Til obviously is the best known. You've got other people that fought with Van Til that had their own versions of it and things like that. Van Til was not the greatest writer because English was not his first language, and so everything is translated from him is not the easiest thing in the world to understand. But the point is that it takes consistently and takes honestly the reality of what we've seen in Scripture. It takes honestly the offensive nature of the gospel, not just to man's pride and not just to man's sin, but more importantly, the amazing claim of the Christian faith that what we're saying is God has entered into his own creation. Because you see, when you really think about how wild that statement is, it closes the door to anything else. If Jesus was who he claimed to be, how could the idea of pluralism make any sense? How can you put Jesus and Buddha and Muhammad or whoever all on the same level? You can't. Not if Jesus was, as the brother on the front row has on his shirt, Jesus is God. That's sort of a nice, in-your-face way of putting it. I'm not sure has it gotten you any conversations during the food lines, but I'm sorry. They stare at you. Not going to say a word because I know what's coming if I do, and it's one of them. If that's true, it changes everything. and Christianity can no longer play nicely with everybody else. You know, that's what we're told we need to do. We need to just play nicely. Let's not say that anybody else is wrong. Well, the problem is, fundamental to the assertion of the Christian faith is this is how God has revealed himself with finality. And if he hasn't, then Christianity isn't true. If Jesus was not who he claimed to be, then the faith just simply doesn't hold up. It is an all or nothing thing, and I think some people are trying to hedge their bets today. I think some people are trying to say, well, we can hold on to certain elements. Well, that's not how the New Testament writers presented it at all. So don't get me wrong. I think Dr. Bonson did feel things like the cosmological argument were, in a sense, unfaithful. But I think, I could be wrong about this, but I think he meant that primarily in the sense that we are being unfaithful as Christians if we present the Christian message in a way that encourages the rebel sinner in his rebellion, and that encouraging someone to think that they do have the power and authority to judge God, rather than recognizing that they are to be judged by God, is encouraging them in their rebellion. Have any of you seen the debate that I did at the University of Illinois with Dan Barker? That one, just a few people. Dan Barker is the head of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, one of the most litigious atheistic organizations in the United States. They're constantly suing somebody. I don't know how many attorneys they have on retainer, but it's an amazing number. They love suing, elementary schools for having Christmas plays and stuff like that. They're really out there doing a lot of good for the world. And Dan Barker is the famous former Christian who loves to say that every year he gets a little check from a Christian publishing house for some musicals he wrote for youth that are still being performed here, there, everywhere. I would like to find out what publishing house that is and say, would you please stop that? Take it out of publication and move on. But Dan's a bright guy. He's very proud of being a bright guy. Member of Mensa and whatever the group of the upper echelon of Mensa is, and blah, 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 blah. If you've seen the debate, you'll know that one of my primary tasks in debating him and in speaking to the students was to make sure that they understood that I was not inviting them to judge the existence of God. I was there to make sure that everyone understood that in light of God's existence, we are the ones who will face him as our judge, not the other way around. Now, you might say, well, that doesn't sound like an effective methodology. What did Paul do in front of the Athenians? He proclaimed openly, there is a day coming when God will judge the living and the dead by the man who rose from the dead, because that puts him in a rather good position to be judged. The man Christ Jesus. As soon as he said resurrection, they began to scoff because they were dualists, and the whole idea of the body rising from the dead was foolishness to them, and so they dismissed him at that point. But Paul knew what they wanted. Paul knew what they would have found to be fascinating. Paul could have done the philosophy thing. Instead, he proclaimed to them the reality of the fact that there was going to be a day of judgment. And so he did not allow them to put themselves in the position of being the judge. And that's vitally, vitally important. Now, there have been some questions about some interaction and some question time before we move from this foundational aspect to some more subjects in regards to the issue of apologetics. Let's go ahead and take a few questions, because some of them might be so foundational that getting to them even this evening would sort of cause us to backtrack a whole lot more than maybe we want to. So I know it's 2:49 in the afternoon, and the coffee has worn off, but if there are some questions, that would be a good time to take some of them if acceptable to you. I mean, I know this is absolutely perfectly clear, and it was so perfectly clear that that like I have no concerns that if I were to become ill or sick or something like that, I'm sure Mike could just
Facebook, if you have
come up here and finish
questions,
all of it off because
post
he's
them
heard
in
all
the
this before, and it's
text,
perfectly clear.
and I will
understandable
try to
to
ask them
everybody.
for you.
Yes, sir.
Hope this is appropriate, not a rabbit trail, but I think at times I've heard you voice maybe a disagreement with Dr. John Frame's method to apologetics, and I was just wondering what would, if I interpreted that correctly, what maybe the disagreement was.
Not really. It's just the trilemma to try whatever it is. It's just not something that I've. I will confess it's not something that I've spent a lot of time with. So it hasn't been. I've never offered a critique or anything like that. It's just not one of the versions of presuppositionalism that I've spent much time on. So no, it really wasn't an issue of saying, well, I see a problem here, a problem there. So no. Yes, sir.
The last couple of years, Frank Turk, I think, has a book called Stealing from God. Seems from the
Right.
title, it seems like he's using a presuppositional apologetic.
Yeah.
He's an evidentialist. What do you think of that?
You repeat the
Yeah.
question? Repeat the question.
Actually, that book, Stealing from God, is the book that Andy Stanley was recommending in his presentation, and hence is attempting to promote. And I got through at least the first portion of the book this past week. And in so doing, I was struck by the fact that he quoted the exact exchange that I played just now. He transcribed it. And I'm like, exactly, there you go. The problem is that already at that point, he had enunciated a very different theology and approach of apologetics that Dr. Bonson would never have accepted, including a form of incrementalism. And when I use the term incrementalism, what I mean is the idea of trying to move people a little bit closer. So move someone from being an atheist to being a deist. That's a good thing, because they're closer now. It's better to be a deist than it is to be an atheist. And then if you can get somebody from deism to Unitarian theism, well, it's better to be a Unitarian theist than a deist. Only one problem with all that. Atheists, deists, and Unitarian theists all go to hell. It's not better, it's just different. And so there is a rejection by Dr. Turek of the presuppositional method, and in fact, the article that I had on the screen this morning enunciates exactly that. So it is interesting to me that my evidentialist friends will recognize the validity of certain elements of, for example, Greg Bonson's statements to Gordon Stein, that, for example, Gordon Stein cannot explain the origination of the laws of logic, the utilization of the laws of logic, etc., etc. That's true. The problem is the real theology that gives the essence to Bonson's argument is the very theology that their synergistic view of the gospel will not allow them to embrace. And that's where the division takes place. And I think Bonson himself probably would have written a blog article if he was still around to be blogging, saying, not sure you want to be quoting me on this, because the background and foundation of my statements to Stein regarding laws of logic, you've already thrown that off, because only a page earlier, page and a half earlier in the book, he had made the direct statement, it's better to be a deist than an atheist. I don't think Bonson would have accepted that. So it's interesting, there's obviously going to be overlap, but the question is who is being consistent between their theology and their apologetic methodology. And obviously, Dr. Bonson's argument at that point could be useful to an evidentialist, but he's not going to have the theological basis to carry it all the way. And that's why I was saying Christopher Hitchens caught stuff like that. And the sharper folks that have thought these things through do catch things like that. So, yeah, you would think that Stealing from God would be a really good title for a book by a presuppositional apologist. And you will find evidentialists who will read the presuppositionalists and go, well, you know, that's a good argument there, that's a good argument there. But if you do not have the theology that underlies it, and that is the electing grace of God and the fact that what's going on in this world is God's glorifying himself, it's all about him, it's not about us, man can't be on the throne judging God, etc., etc. If you don't have that theology, you really can't follow the methodology through.
If you have questions for Dr. White, type
Yes, sir.
them into the comment box and I will ask them for you.
Hi, Greg Corbin.
Yeah, I think it was Friday or something, he was answering about presupposition. And he said something about, he was arguing that the apostles didn't use that. He said, well, when Peter, when they said that he was drunk, he was using basic reasoning, that knows the Holy Spirit didn't go to Scripture. Or like when John was fighting with the agnostics, he said, well, we touched God, Jesus, and we felt him and stuff. And he was saying that they were just using evidence of experiences and stuff.
Well, that would be a category error because they're not dealing with individuals who are atheists, first of all. It has nothing to do with the existence of God. It's not providing a foundation for a theistic worldview or anything else. First of all, if you're dealing with the Gnostics, you're dealing with heretics. And the Gnostic heretics are claiming to believe in Jesus, but you're giving a false Jesus. So you're not going to be dealing with theistic proofs or anything along the lines of that. And the thing with Peter, what was
Like
it?
in Acts 1, when they thought they were drunk, but they were speaking.
Yeah, I'm sorry. There's such a massive category difference between no, we're not drunk, and God exists because of this. I don't even know how to approach that. I have a hard time believing that because Greg has had a fair amount of influence from Reformed sources. I would think you would have I would think you would have a significantly better understanding of what the issues are, what the categories are, and recognize that has nothing to do with presuppositionalism at all. But there is, unfortunately, a very common misunderstanding that presuppositionalists can never even. Here's the viewpoint of many evidentialists. That when a presuppositionalist tries to say this word, this is what happens. Well, then there's the can't do it. Can't say evidence. That's their idea. And that's why I asked how many of you had seen my debate with Dan Barker. Because I presented all sorts of evidence. I even included a little clip, Sam will find this interesting, on ATP synthase. Because I felt like, look, here is, wow, this is what's happening right in front of you. This is actually happening right inside you, not just in front of you, all around you, actually. And I presented evidence. But I did not present evidence in a way to invite the unbeliever to think that he had the right to utilize that evidence to deny the existence of God. I was presenting the evidence to demonstrate the consistency of the Christian worldview and the fact that while they live in God's world, they can see these things, but they can't explain these things consistently. They have to violate their own worldview to live in God's world. So I was doing with evidence what I did with Eric in allowing him to talk long enough to tie himself in knots. And that totally changes the very presentation that you're making. And I was not saying to them, if you just look at this, the ponderance of the evidence points to the greater possibility of the existence of a God. I do not consider that Christian apologetics. That's theistic apologetics in some sense. But there is a huge, huge chasm called the Grand Canyon between that and the apologetics of the apostles. Yes, sir. If that's what you were doing, either that, your head's hot and you were trying to get some air
get
going.
your attention.
Yes.
Can you comment on two doctors One is Cornell West and Dr. James Manning. Are
No,
you
I'm not.
familiar with him?
No, no.
Okay.
Sorry. Are they Christian theologians? No?
Manning is. He's the fiery preacher of in Harlem.
Sorry. Is he involved in apologetics or something?
Yes,
Okay.
and it's on YouTube.
Well, what isn't?
Well, he's of the opinion, he's highly opinionated, and he takes issue with politicians, including Obama.
Okay. There's a lot of that on YouTube, but I'm not familiar with him as far as.
What about Cornell West? You have to know about him.
Well,
He's
sorry, I know. I know of someone else with the last name of West.
Alan West.
Huh?
Alan.
Alan, yeah. But I don't know about him. Gotta realize YouTube today is. What has that turned into? I mean, there's everything on YouTube. People send me stuff about me on YouTube every single day, and it's amazing. People
he's
sitting.
a very liberal black guy.
Well, there's none of them on YouTube either. Yeah. Now, send me someone who's a really conservative one, and then I have a better shot at it. But no, I'm not familiar with either one. Sorry.
Can I get?
Yes, sir. Oh, well, the guy behind you's gonna hit you. But go ahead.
Um,
And he can reach a long ways, so keep it short.
how do you? Because when you debate Muslims, you accept the fact that you believe God reveals something, and we do too. Let's see what's consistent. So, but there's some that would argue that, like even like Jason Lyle, you just use the presuppositional position just because they don't hold. They're Unitarian, right? So you
Right.
Just prove it that way. How does that?
Excellent question, and this is one that I've struggled with for a long time. Dr. Bonson did some what we would call interfaith debate, but not a lot. He made some comments on Islam, but he was not an expert in Islam. You could tell that he had not had really much in the way of interaction with Muslims and things like that. And so people do ask the question, okay, all right, if you're talking about arguing transcendentally, and that's what Dr. Bonson was doing. He was arguing for the impossibility of the contrary, that without the Christian God, there can be no explanation for anything else. How does that work when you're dealing with a theistic system? And obviously, I don't see the transcendentalism. Obviously, I see the application of presuppositionalism must be different in the application to theistic systems that accept the necessity of the existence of a God. And atheists. Once you get to the idea of someone who says, well, I have a revelation from God, and this is the God that exists, now the issue becomes, well, an internal critique of their position, because if they're Unitarians, then there's going to be the issue of how can there be such thing as love, how can the personality of a undivided monad through all of eternity, et cetera, et cetera. But especially the real issue with Islam is not just a religion that exists over on the other side of the planet and has no connection with Christianity. This is something you need to understand. Islam sees itself organically and necessarily connected to Christianity and Judaism, because the Quran very plainly not only identifies us as the al-Kitab, the people of the book, but in essence says that the prophets of the Jews, Jesus himself, were all vitally important links in the chain of revelation leading to Muhammad. So you can't have an Islam that does not assert that at some point in time there was full religious divine authority in the proclamation of Moses, Abraham, David, Jesus, and that without that chain, you don't have Muhammad. So the internal critique that we as Christians offer to Islam, I think, is devastatingly strong because of the fact that Islam, by its very definition and nature, traces its own origination and history through ours. And so the fact that fundamentally there is a U-turn in the understanding of the Quran back to not even to a full Judaism, but to almost a Paleo-Judaism, and the fact that the Quran shows so little familiarity with the preceding revelations, whereas the New Testament shows such deep familiarity with the Old. That's really where I think the fundamental proof of the error of Islam is to be found in its own self-definition, its inconsistency. And anyway, I could expand upon that some more, but that would take us into some areas we haven't even started on yet. So. Yes, sir?
Why is evidentialism getting so popular?
Oh, it's not that it's getting so popular, it always has been.
The question is about evidentialism.
And why is it so popular? Because of the theological foundation that underlies it. In other words, right now I'm teaching church history at my church. I'm not sure how many. Are any of you following the church history series? Okay, a couple of you are. I'm teaching church history in Sunday school. We're putting on sermon audio. One of the most popular series I ever did was back in the 90s. I did church history at PRBC. This time I'm doing it at about 1/3 the speed that I did before. So it's going to be long. It took me 11 years to get through the Synoptic Gospels. So I'm not sure how long it's going to take me to get through the Reformation anyways. But if you look at the theology of the church, and I'm using the church here now in a very general sense, down through history, it is a repetitive demonstration of the fact that man has an insatiable desire to insert himself into the glory of God and salvation. If you look at the Pelagian controversy, if you look at the Reformation, if you look at any of these huge issues in history of the church, what you see is the fact that mankind is constantly looking for a way to grab some portion of control of salvation for himself. That text we looked at in 1 Corinthians 1:30, by his doing you are in Christ Jesus, that destroys the ability of man to create structures to control other men religiously. And that's what man wants to do. You want to control your fellow men. There are people who would eschew all the money in the world as long as they can control other people. There are gurus in this world, they don't care what kind of money they have, as long as people are constantly coming to them, asking them, getting their advice, getting their direction. It's the very essence of cult leadership. The point is that if you read church history, you see this constant bend away from the grace of God back into some form of cooperation. Look at the development over time. And Roman Catholic historians will admit this. The entire sacramental system of Rome developed over time. There was no sacramental priesthood in the early church, anything like that. So if you didn't have priests, then you didn't have a bunch of the other sacraments that would depend upon the priests and so on and so forth. But it developed over time as a means of controlling the grace of God. There is that absolute bent upon man's part to do away with this complete dependency upon God. And so, when you see the development within Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, of these synergistic systems, and when I say synergistic systems, I'm assuming most of you know what that means, but again, just to make sure, where you have a cooperative effort, where you've got God trying and man trying, and unfortunately, it's normally dependent upon whether man tries properly, as to whether man's going to get saved, so on and so forth. When you have the development of those systems, then of necessity, the apologetics that they are utilizing is going to have to follow. The degradation, the sub-biblical nature, the slide downward away from a pure Pauline perspective to something else. And so the popularity of it is that, again, if you're a synergist treating the lost man as judge, that goes with what your theology is. And so it's not that it's become popular, it's just always has been. Always has been. Now, if you go back to the Reformation, I think I would argue, if you listen carefully to how Calvin argues, I think Van Til had his finger on the pulse. That doesn't mean that Calvin thought of everything Van Til did, but what I'm saying is that they're, as Mueller has said, and Mueller knows everything about those centuries, they recognized in the supremacy of Scripture over against Rome's claims of authority the necessity of seeing that that revelation requires it to be sufficient and full in of itself without having to look to outside sources. And so that really is, I think, consistent with the Reformation perspective. But let's face it, it's also more popular because, well, someone, Mike Patton just put an article out the day before we sailed. And if you've seen it, I have it. In fact, I might. Yeah, there it is. Why Arminianism won't preach and Calvinism won't sell. And fundamentally, his argument is the Calvinists have the best theological conferences, but apologetics belongs to the Arminians. Yes, I will be reviewing it. Like, duh. Hi on Facebook, we will be reviewing that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you bet. But that's basically his argument. So recognizes the high theology that Reformed folks have, but evidently claims that we don't do apologetics. And I think he just doesn't see that we've been fairly active at it for a long time. Yes, sir.
You said when you were debating with Dan Barker that you used some evidence.
Yes, I did.
Proofs. What sort of proofs would you go for in that kind of debate? I mean, would you, for example, use some of Ken Ham's kind of material?
Well, again, I wouldn't, at that point, I would not use the term proofs. Because a proof assumes the worldview that would give the proof validity, and I was critiquing the other worldview. What I did specifically is I showed a oops.
Wait for him to.
It's been called one of the wonders of the molecular world, an amazing nanoscale machine. ATP synthase is a high-tech micromolecular power generator inside the cells of your body. It generates adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, an energy molecule that provides fuel that every one of your cells needs to function. Without this fuel, your cells will cease operation, and so will you. ATP synthase works like a rotary engine. The barrel-shaped rotator is composed of 10 to 15 protein parts called subunits. The rotator
spins around, transmitting mechanical energy into the drive shaft of the machine, which helps make ATP. This drive shaft has a specially placed bump that opens and closes parts as the drive shaft spins around. This bump opens special protein subunits on the bottom of the machine. When the bottom subunits open, a spent energy molecule called adenosine diphosphate, or ADP, enters the machine. The mechanical motion causes the ADP to bind with an additional phosphate group, creating the ATP energy molecule. And the ATP drifts off into the cell, ready to power some biomechanical reaction. The ATP synthase machine has many parts we recognize from human-designed technology. A rotor, a stator, a drive shaft, and other basic components of a rotary engine. The ATP synthase is one of thousands of elegantly designed molecular machines inside your cells that make your life and all known life possible. ATP synthase. An example of intelligent design.
Now that's not the exact video that I played, but it's pretty close. And even that, honestly, is a very simplified presentation. That little machine can run backwards. It runs on a proton gradient. ATP is an incredible. I mean, if any of you studied electron chain transport, Krebs cycle, glycolysis, all these incredible things that we've only discovered over the past 50, 60 years. The complexity and design is just absolutely astounding. And we can't produce anything like this as yet. It really makes your iPhone look rather simplistic and rather big and bulky too. And the point is that if you can't see the design of that, then you shouldn't be able to see the design of your iPhone either. But when I presented it, I probably could pull up the thing in Keynote right now and show it to you. But when I presented it, the screen before I showed it specifically addressed the fact that I am by presenting this not inviting you to judge the God who created these things, but that the God you know exists is the only one sufficient to create these incredible things. And he is the one I'm calling you not to judge his existence, but to bow before him as your maker. So it's different. Totally, I'm not trying to flatter the person into accepting my proof. I'm attempting to present the evidence with such clarity, trusting that the Holy Spirit will make it to be useful in the way that he chooses to make it useful. And by the way, sometimes he chooses to make that information useful in judgment. I hate to stop with a bummer, with a downer, but let me address that for a second. When you all came in, there was a tract. You all have a nice, pretty tract. Rich was busily printing and folding, stapling, mutilating. I heard him going out to the printer more than once, going, "Oh, great, that didn't work." And then, a few minutes later, oh man, and then back into his office, and finally got these printed out. Christian Messages tract I wrote. Oh my goodness, I don't even remember when I wrote that tract. It was many moons ago.
I think in '89, maybe '90.
Yeah, somewhere along those lines. We used to go out to Mesa, Arizona, out to the General Conference of the Mormon Church up in Salt Lake City. One reason we stopped doing those things was because the street screechers showed up and destroyed those types of possibilities of outreach. But when we had those opportunities, there would be many times we would see those tracts, including the earlier incarnation of that tract, taken by people, torn up. Josh went with me when he was about, how old were you that year? I forget what year it was, but Josh went with me up to Salt Lake once, and he had his white shirt, and a little Rush Limbaugh tie on,
Matched yours.
What?
It matched yours.
It matched mine, I know. And so he was passing out some tracts, and I remember the first time. This guy came up to him. We were at the south gate of the Mormon Temple in Salt Lake, and he walks up to Josh. He takes a tract from him, and he tears it up into a few pieces, and reaches down and pulls the front pocket of his shirt open. And I'm already moving at this point, and stuffs it in his pocket and pats it and walks off. And I just remember the look on his, he sort of turns around, looks at me, and his eyes are just big as saucers, like, what do I do now? You know? And I was like, well, hey, glad you got that over with. Now you don't have to worry about it happening the second time, and we just go on from here. You know, it's something, there's going to be rejection. And we would find those tracks on the ground, and they'd be torn up or stepped on or spit on or whatever else. And you have to, there's two ways of looking at that. If your theology is such, you're going to go, wow, I failed. Maybe the tract wasn't pretty enough. It didn't have the right picture on the front. Or maybe I didn't hand it out right, or something like that. Well, don't get me wrong. I don't think we should hand out ugly tracts that are just people, well, look at that. And I don't think you should purposefully take this, you scummy sinner. You know, I don't want to get in the way and so on and so forth. But the idea was, for many people, they look at that and, oh, there's a failure, oh, you know. And my theology says, when we passed out tracts, we looked at them, we called them fallen warriors. But they had done what they were intended to do. We pass out tracts for two reasons. Well, first of all, we pass out tracts for one reason: glorify God. We're being obedient to Him. We want to proclaim His truth. We're glorifying God. But we recognize they go out for two purposes. What we want to see them do is to lead to the salvation of individuals. We want to see God use that information by the Holy Spirit through the power of the gospel to draw His like people into Himself. But we've read 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And we've read Acts chapter 17. And all the rest of the narratives of the apostles. And no matter how powerful they were, how clearly they preached, when they preached that message, yes, there was salvation, but there was always opposition, and there was always rejection. Does that mean they failed? No, that was the very purpose that God put them there for. And so sometimes tracts go out, sometimes messages are preached, and they are for condemnation. Because the day is going to come when someone's going to stand before God, and they're never going to be able to say, I didn't know. I didn't hear. Oh, yes, you did. You not only knew, you suppressed it, and then when you heard more of it, you suppressed it more, and here's the examples of it. Here's the examples of it. And so, I don't consider it failure when you have that type of rejection. And folks, unless God grants repentance to our culture, already many Christians in many other cultures have been reaping a harvest of one soul at a time. Tremendous amount of work to get that one person. We've had it easy for a long, long time. And if you don't have it in your mind that God is pleased and God is glorified when you are faithfully presenting His truth, even when it is being rejected over and over. If you think that rejection means that you're not doing what God would have you to do, I don't know how you're going to keep going. I mean, the mindset of many evangelicals back in the 70s and 80s, that if you don't have a graph and it's going like this, your church is a failure, that don't work under persecution. That's missing the whole point. Why do we do apologetics? We do it in the sight of God, first and foremost, to honor and glorify Him. And hence we must handle His truth in such a way that is honoring and glorifying to Him. To manhandle it so that it somehow accomplishes something that we think it's supposed to accomplish, that's not an option. That's not an option. Never has been. Okay? Okay, so I will ask Brother O'Fallon to give us final exhortations for this evening's
activities,
Facebook.
and
We'll
go
update you
from
on
there.
when the next session will be.